All right, enough jibber jabber about that stuff. What the plan is this week is I've been wanting to do this for a while, but the problem is that I couldn't really think about how I wanted to do it. And what happened, what sort of spurred this, is a book when I was moving I had found in my collection of books. And like a lot of people, I have far too many books. I've read them. Well, there's some I haven't read. I probably have 100 books kicking around here that I haven't read. Maybe 100 or so. But most I actually have read. So even if it's I have 1,000 books, let's say it's 100, so 90%, let's just say. But I'll never read them a second time. I don't know why I hang on to them. But anyway, I found this book that I had read probably. I'm going to say it was it was somewhere in the late Clinton years, so second term Clinton. I didn't get it when it was new. It was actually a used book, and it was written in 1992, and it's by Bill Buckley. And it's In Search of Antisemitism. And I have to say, I remember the essays that this was based on that he wrote in National Review in the 1980s. I started reading National Review in high school. I think a lot of people could say that. When Paul Ramsey and I, on our Wednesday show, we did the Reagan years, Reagan in the 1980s, he mentioned the fact that he was reading National Review when he was a teenager. Well, so was I. And it was one of those odd things. I didn't know anything about this until I saw a reference to National Review. I think it was like this person, in the op-ed section of the paper, this person is a National Review contributor or something like that. So I went to my library, which was a thing you could do back then, and get the copy of the magazine. And strangely enough, my local library, a small town library, had a subscription to National Review. And that's one of those things that people don't realize, that most of, like back in the old days, magazines had a lot of subscriptions to libraries and, of course, institutions. And that stuff, a lot of that stuff went away. I mean, some of it still kicks around. Libraries don't have online subs, but like National Review, I bet you half of its online subs are to people who work at American Enterprise, Cato, Heritage, Brookings, probably even the left-wing sites, So, they have these institutional subscriptions that keep them going. And of course, that money comes from rich people. You pull that stuff away. If they actually, National Review had to survive, even back in the old days, just on subscription, it would have went out of business. It wouldn't have been able to survive. But anyway, the point is that this was 1980s material. Well, anyway, I found this book, and it's funny. I bought the book for $1 because the price tag is still on it. So I must have picked this up at a used bookstore. I remember reading this in the 90s. It was after Buchanan ran, so it was probably, I think it was after his second run, so after 96, so sometime in that range. And I remember the essays, but to be perfectly honest, when I was a teenager, I didn't understand any of this material. It just bored the hell out of me. I didn't really have any sense of what anti-Semitism was or why I should care about it. And even when I read, these articles in National Review, it still didn't register very much. I just didn't care. But when Buchanan got ran out of the movement in the 90s and Sam Francis got ran out, all these purges started happening. And all of it was always the same thing. It was always about Israel or America's support of Israel or just the claims of anti-Semitism. If you didn't support Israel, you were going to be called an anti-Semite. So anyway, I wound up buying this book and reading it. And it was a funny thing is that even when I read it, to be honest, back then, I didn't really quite get what was going on. I was still a young person, so it didn't really quite register. But many years later, when I found this book here in my stack when I was moving back in December of 2023 now. No, I take that back. It was the spring of 2024. So about a year ago, I found this book and it brought back a lot of memories. And so I wound up thumbing through it, and it was funny. I had forgotten a lot of stuff that was in here. And so much of it actually pertains to today in a very weird way. It's one of those things that if you could go back in time and know what you know now and go back to then, if I had read this back in the 1990s, I would have understood all of this cancel stuff going on, the purges, the rift on the right, all the stuff that came along with Trump and how they reacted. All this stuff would have made a lot more sense to me. I mean, it made sense. I mean, I understood it, but I would have been able to anticipate it because so much of what has happened over the last 10 years is a replay of things that happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. And you're talking about the events, or some of the events here with regarding Joe Sobran happened in the 1980s. So we're getting close to 40 years. And it's a long time. But it really kind of shows, the old expression, past is prologue. The things that are described in this book about, well, from Buckley's perspective, and Buckley was a fairly well-known liar, so much of what he wrote in there is a lie, and I'll get into that in a bit. But, the things that Buckley did to not just Sobran, but other people. But Sobran seems to be the real first one, although some people would say he did the same shenanigans to the Birchers. I tend to dismiss that claim, because the Birchers were making some pretty outlandish claims, that Eisenhower was actually in league with the communists. He was a communist agent. They were very, Lyndon LaRouche-like. People old enough to remember Lyndon and LaRouche will get that. But, imagine if, Alex Jones was serious about all of his conspiracy mongering. That's closer to what these guys are. But anyway, I think Sobran was really the trial run where Buckley and conservatives, really, cut their teeth on how to banish people to the outer darkness. And then this model eventually became the model for politics. And we saw this play out time and time again over the last 10 years. Now, before we get into that, we have to talk a little bit about who Joe Sobran was. And if he were alive today, he would still plausibly be alive today. He was born in 1946. And I guess you could say he was a boomer, And he eventually, he was a Midwestern guy, born in Michigan, went to college in Michigan, was a Catholic, came from kind of quintessential Midwest stock. His family came from parts of Austria and Hungary, and I think his mother was English and his father was German, something like that. So very, very typical Midwestern background. Went off to a Midwestern college and eventually got into the newspaper business, writing columns and writing for magazines. He actually wrote for National Review for a very long time. And he was, in his day, people considered him one of the great polemicists of the era. He was such a good writer. He actually gave speeches and lectures on Shakespeare and other English writers. He was a very, very knowledgeable guy with regards to the history of the language and the use of the language. And it turned up in his columns. He was one of these kind of guys that back in the old days when there were newspapers, you made a point to, if he was a regular in your local paper, you made a point to say, oh, well, his column always shows up on Wednesday. You bought the paper and read it on Wednesday. A lot like how not Bill Buckley, Pat Buchanan was. Pat Buchanan was one of those guys that he sold a lot of papers because people wanted to read Pat Buchanan. All the other crap that was in the paper was junk, but you'd read Pat Buchanan. I remember this as a young person. I would buy a newspaper sometimes. There weren't a lot of money, obviously, back then. And I would just read the editorials, and they're the guys I liked. And I would throw the rest away because the rest of it was crap, other than maybe the box scores if I was following baseball or something. And that's how good these guys were. They were so good. They're the kind of, in their day, they were the kind of people in our day who have a podcast that as soon as it dings on your phone, you say, oh, I got to listen to this. Or, they do a show every week on YouTube and you say, it's must see. I gotta watch it as soon as it comes out. That's who a guy like Sobran was. He was in that class, which also meant that he was very quotable. People still quote Sobran today, despite the fact that he, was hurled into the void a long time ago, 30 years ago, and official publications, official conservatism, official Washington, the chattering classes have all put him on mute and refused to ever mention him. He still gets quoted a lot. And there's a good reason for it, because his quotes were very pithy. I'm going to go ahead and go through some of them just to give you an idea, especially people who aren't familiar with it. And there's a lot of probably listeners who have heard all these before, but, younger people for sure would never have run across these. For example, liberalism is really piecemeal socialism, and socialism always attacks three basic social institutions: religion, the family, and private property. Religion because it offers a rival authority to the state, the family because it means a rival loyalty to the state, and property because it means material independence from the state. This is something that we still talk about now. People who write and comment on social media still make these points, and this guy made these points 40 years ago, 50 years ago in this case. An anti-Semite used to mean a man who hated Jews. Now it means a man who is hated by the Jews. That's one that comes up a lot too. Let's see. Democracy has proved only that the best way to gain power over people is to assure the people that they are ruling themselves. Once they believe that, they make wonderfully submissive slaves. Very true. This is something you see from me on a fair occasion, that I'll mention this, I call it the fig leaf of democracy. This is one I tend to post on 4th of July, and it's funny. All these MAGA people on Gab always flip out when I post this. It just kind of tells you how a certain segment of the population enjoys being suckers. But this is one I've always enjoyed. By today's standards, King George III was a very mild tyrant. He taxed his American colonists at a rate of only pennies per annum. His actual impact on their personal lives was trivial. He had an arbitrary power over them in law and in principle, but in fact it was seldom exercised. If you compare his rule with that of today's U.S. government, you have to wonder why we celebrate our independence at all. That's very true. I mean, it's amazing in a way to compare how people live in a modern America, right? We're the most technologically advanced society and we've got the best of everything and all this stuff. If you look at just how much genuine freedom we have and how much of our labor we can keep compared to people 100 years ago, it's jaw-dropping. But more important, when you compare it to how hard people actually worked 100 or 200 years ago. The average medieval peasant, I'm not talking about a serf, someone who was a slave or, was tied to the land, but, your average, guy who owned a plot of land and grew enough crops to feed himself and sell the rest for, to buy other things. That guy worked a hell of a lot less than we do. Sure, he busted his ass certain times of the year, no doubt about it. But he had long stretches of time where he didn't really have a lot to do, and he could indulge in other things. Compared to just a few generations ago, we have vastly less freedom and vastly less economic security. I mean, it really is quite a remarkable change. Here's one that, one fashion or another I've used many times. If you want government to intervene domestically, you're a liberal. If you want government to intervene overseas, you're a conservative. If you want government to intervene everywhere, you're a moderate. And if you don't want the government to intervene anywhere, you're an extremist. It really is true. I mean, you think of what the domestic extremism is, not just in the United States, but in Europe, are people who don't want endless wars of choice, that don't want people thrown into jail without due process, who don't want people's rights trampled and so forth, who basically just want to be left alone. Well, guess what? You get treated as an extremist. You're a white supremacist. Now, probably the most famous quote, there's a bunch of them here. I may link this up if I remember. But this is probably the most famous quote that you could see. I don't know. It's a very famous quote. Here it goes. Western man towers over the rest of the world in ways so large as to be almost inexpressible. It's Western exploration, science, and conquest that have revealed the world to itself. Other races feel like subjects of Western power long after colonialism, imperialism, and slavery have disappeared. The charge of racism puzzles whites who feel not hostility, but only baffled goodwill, because they don't grasp what it really means, humiliation. The white man presents an image of superiority even when he isn't conscious of it, and superiority excites envy. Destroying white civilization is the inmost desire of the league of designated victims we call minorities. Amazingly true. Now, I don't exactly know when this was written. I think it was like the 1990s, 2000s. But either way, you're talking about a quote that has really stood the test of time. Now, Sobran wasn't just a very quotable guy. I mean, he had a long career. He was a columnist for, I think it was United Press. He wrote for all these different newspapers. He did bits on CBS radio. I mean, he spent 21 years as a radio guy. I mean, this guy was a highly productive guy. And of course, he wrote for National Review. I think his column was called Washington Watch. I'm pretty sure it was, or maybe, yeah, I'm pretty sure it was Washington Watch. I could be mistaken. Don't hold me to that one. But he wrote for a ton of different publications. He also wrote for Chronicles magazine, which was around back then. Although I think Chronicles came along after maybe the 90s, something like that. I'm not 100% sure. But he started getting himself in trouble when the neocons started gaining control of the Republican Party, particularly foreign policy. And he started making two critiques. One, he was a critic of the Gulf War. He was opposed to that. He was opposed to the Second Gulf War. He was opposed to, all these wars of choice. And he was also opposed to this blank check to Israel. He kept pointing out that Israel was a very unreliable partner. This greatest ally we had was, always getting us in trouble, always creating problems that we had to come and fix in the Middle East. He took a very sort of sensible position on Israel. Support Israel. You give them money and you give them weapons maybe or something like that, but you don't want to get involved with Israel and the Middle East and their policies. Because if you do, you're going to end up bogged down in all these things. And this is an old argument, it's been made a million times, but back then these were still somewhat novel. But a lot of conservatives, people who eventually became paleoconservatives, called paleoconservatives, kind of held to this old idea that, look, we have a moral duty to confront the Soviets, but we want to avoid doing things like nation building in Vietnam. That was a left-wing project. We don't want to get bogged down in these minor areas and stuff. We want to just focus on the big stuff with the Soviets so the world doesn't blow up and communism doesn't win. But all these little trivial areas, they need to be left to kind of figure things out for themselves. I mean, who cares if Angola goes communist? No one's going to notice a difference there. That was generally his position. But of course, what happened back then is that if you questioned, which seems familiar, any questioning of Israel started to be considered, well, is this really just a stalking horse for anti-Semitism? In other words, they found a way to accuse people who are Israel skeptics of being anti-Semites. And in the case of Sobran, he clearly wasn't an anti-Semite. He didn't say anything that was anti-Semitic. He was an anti-Zionist. And I don't remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure that he, embraced that term, that he was an anti-Zionist. And that's what got run out of conservatism, though. But what's important about this, because, this is a familiar story now. I mean, the Trump administration is literally deporting people for things that Joe Sobran wrote 40 years ago in newspaper columns. I mean, it really is gotten to that point. But I don't want to get too far into that. Really what I want to get to here is this process. This is really the important bit here. And I can't remember anymore. I tried looking in National Review's archives. I tried searching this. I actually did a fair amount of actual legwork on this podcast because I just got curious about a lot of stuff. And the book is supposedly reprints of Buckley's essays, and then on the subject, Sobran, antisemitism, Buchanan, and then letters back and forth between him and other people who are telling him how wonderful he is, of course. And so I don't remember if this was in the actual articles of it. I think it was. But anyway, he starts out his chapter on Sobran, which was really the beginning of this whole Buckley chasing off the anti-Semites business. I mean, the whole story of Buckley prepares here in this book is how he is a righteous Gentile who saved conservatism from these evil anti-Semites. Well, here's what he starts with. And he starts from this letter. He claims that he got a letter from Mr. Horan of Fort Smith, Arkansas. And the letter came in June in 1991, soon after we published an article by Joe Sobran to the effect that it was the Earl of Oxford who had written the plays universally attributed to Shakespeare. And the writer caught what humor is to be found in Sobran and the problem, and touches, however, inadvertently on some questions I intend to explore. So I'm going to go ahead, don't have time here, I'm going to go ahead and read this letter. Dear Mr. Buckley, look, I love the hell out of Joe Sobran, but I think that he is getting a little kooky. In fact, I think that he's getting a lot kooky. I'd like to think that he inhaled a little too much side stream smoke when he took his boy to see the Rolling Stones, but that was 2 years ago. If Mr. Sobran is not peddling variants on the blood libel, he's schmoozing with Liberty Lobby or running on with the Earl of Oxford or moaning about how he's going to get whooped in the desert. The boy needs a rest. Mr. Sobran is the best Agener I've ever seen. This Agener is in quotes. Down my part of the country, an Agener is a feller who is against most everything in general. By and by, these folks have to tell you what they are for as a way of explaining why they are against something that is going on as I speak. The world has done mostly turned Joe's way in the past 3 years. Hell, even the universities are getting sick of PC. It's a good reminder here. In 5 years, the Mr. Sobran is going to have nothing which he can legitimize against. I'm not really sure what that means. Well, anyway, this letter goes on basically to accuse Joe Sobran of anti-Semitism, and it's supposedly from a guy named Matthew Horan in Fort Smith, Arkansas. So I went and tried to figure out if such a person existed. And I spent a few hours trying to figure this out. And I got nowhere. And I found some names, and I actually made some calls. And I was unable to verify that this letter ever existed and that such a person wrote it and sent it to Buckley. Because I think it's fake. And the reason I think it's fake is that it's too good to be true. This is what the movie people call a McGuffin. Now, a McGuffin, it's an object, a thing, maybe it's an event that's necessary to the plot and the motivation of the characters, but in and of itself, it's not really important or significant. And a lot of times it's, you probably all have seen stories where, the average guy all of a sudden has an extraordinary event and it sends him on his journey, right? That's a pretty standard thing. Or, sometimes there's like horror movies where some object comes into the possession of the people, and it, or the movie Poltergeist, right? I think, didn't that begin with some sort of artifact that belonged to, some group of people who had been buried where the house was built or something like that, that kind of thing. If you remember the movie Pulp Fiction, there was a briefcase in there. And the movie, much of it is driven by this briefcase, even though the briefcase itself is totally insignificant. You got the famous scene of him shooting all those guys, and he opens the briefcase, and he sees the glow, and he closes it, and you never know what it is. And the black guy sends them off, John Travolta and the other guy, to get the briefcase, and so much of his adventure is do this. Everybody is somehow or other moved by this briefcase, even though the case itself and what's in it turns out to be completely insignificant. And R2-D2 in Star Wars, there's even a better one. R2-D2 is a completely meaningless character in the original Star Wars, but he sets it all off with the hologram of "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi," that kind of thing. That's what this is. This is a MacGuffin. He puts this letter together, and again, I don't think that it's real. I mean, it might be kind of real, and who knows? I mean, but he uses this as this triggering event. Here he is, just regular old Bill Buckley, minding his own business, just not really thinking much about the world. And all of a sudden, this thing happens, and he starts to look at things completely different than he did in the past. And this has become a common device in cancel culture, right? Time and time again, we see this, that it's not that the person who is decided that, Fred Jones, we've had enough of him, he's got to go, he's no longer our sort. They always say, well, it came to our attention, or we've had complaints. This imaginary person, the invisible person in the room, has become a standard way in which the modern age, the last 30, 40 years, deals with people who do not go along with the currently held fads and beliefs. And look, it's not just politics this happens. It happens in the private sector. I remember probably in the 90s having a conversation with someone in HR, and this person, the woman, of course, saying, some people say this. It was about this guy. I forget what the heck happened anymore, but, they were demanding that I do something about one of these people who reported to me. And all the conversation was, well, some people have said he did this, and some people have said he did that. And I remember this conversation, I'll remember it forever, because I said, well, what's the name of these some people? Who are they? And they said, well, we can't tell you. That would be inappropriate. And I said, well, what if I told you that some people, and I won't say what I said here, it was a family show. Well, I mean, they were all scandalized, but you could just make up whatever you want. But that is what happens. And that's what I think this is. I think this letter and this whole setting is just a MacGuffin. It's this plot device that Buckley created to say, look, I've got this pressure on me to get rid of Joe Sobran. I got to find a way to get rid of this guy because he's making arguments that, well, frankly, the people who are running the show in conservatism, who are increasingly running the Republican Party, well, they don't like those things he's saying. They don't like the questions he's asking. We got to do something about it. But I can't come out and say, I'm not going to do this because, well, that kind of gives the game away. So he comes up with this bullshit, letter saying, oh, well, I'm just an average guy. I'm one of your faithful readers. I'm just a regular good old boy in our company. I mean, if you read the letter, and I don't know, I can't really, maybe I could scan it or something. I couldn't find an actual copy online because, again, I don't think it actually exists. But it reads, it reads like it was written by somebody who had never been to Arkansas, but imagined what people in Arkansas would write if they wrote a letter to a guy in Connecticut. That's what it sounds like to me. And that's what this whole setup is. And the rest of this chapter, you see this time and again, I'll get to this in a minute, of where Buckley is claiming that, he's trying everything he can to rescue Joe Sobran and prevent him from throwing his career away and submit as, succumbing to this just terrible brain disease of anti-Semitism. But even though Bill Buckley, generous-hearted Bill Buckley, did everything he could for his old pal Joe Sobran. And look, up to this point, they had been friends for like 25 years. So what Buckley's about to do after this letter is trash the reputation of an old friend and pretend that somehow or other he's the victim. That Bill Buckley is the guy who's the victim, that, he did all these wonderful things to try and help Joe Sobran, but Joe Sobran just kept forging ahead with his crazy ideas about the Jews and Israel and the Israel lobby and all this stuff. In other words, what Buckley is doing, and when it starts with this McGuffin, and this is a thing we see all the time, is he starts out saying, I've got to get rid of this guy because it's bad for my business. But I need to manufacture an excuse, and then I got to pretend I'm actually the victim. Bill Buckley is getting ready to ruin a man's career, ruin his reputation, and actively work so that he's basically erased from the history books. And then that way, Buckley then can pretend that he was the victim. He's the guy that everyone should not only feel sorry for having to have to go through this, but really just be so proud that he persevered through these difficult times. This is a pattern we've seen over and over and over again, whether it's left-wing people throwing white males out of the newspaper. The whole cancel culture business was left-wing crazies throwing white guys out, right? And they all follow the same thing. It was always, well, it's come to our attention, and oh my God, it pains us terribly. We have to do this, but he's left us no choice. This bastard, he's brought all these bad ideas into our house, and we got to get him out of here. And and that's the pattern that started 40 years ago with conservatives. Bill Buckley, I would argue, invented the model of cancel culture, and you see it here with Joe Sobran. Now, another thing Buckley introduced, and maybe this was there all along, but basically this peremptory surrender. This is a trick that these guys, conservatives, have done this my whole life. And I didn't used to notice it. But then, probably somewhere in the Clinton years, I started realizing that, wait a second, every time these guys stand up to oppose the left, the first thing they do is concede a whole bunch of things that they had no reason to concede at all. And what they're really doing is reinforcing these, the claims, the moral claims of the people they claim to oppose in this sort of ritualized failed opposition. And you really you see how this works with Buckley, who was a very shrewd guy. Buckley was a very, very smart guy in a way, but he was a very shrewd guy. Smart people know how to solve problems. Shrewd people know how to get other people to solve problems. That's the difference there. And Buckley was very, very shrewd guy. Well, anyway, early in his book, after this letter, we get this section here. I have some credentials in the areas talking about anti-Semitism. Among them, my own father's anti-Semitism. It is probably never too early to distinguish the kinds of anti-Semitism we run into in the world. The apocalyptic kind was, of course, the Holocaust. And I'll be asking whether the shadow of the Holocaust is being made to stretch too far in contemporary polemics. This is different from denying that the Holocaust will always be, one of the great historical ventures in denatured human barbarism. There are Jews who continue to fear that the fires that lit the Holocaust might one day be rekindled. But there are also Jews who, comfortable with the protocols built upon around Auschwitz, are disposed, so to speak, to prolong the period of denazification indefinitely. And fierce anti-Semitism of the threatening kind continues, for instance, among Palestinians. Probably a higher percentage of them hate Jews more than Germans ever hated Jews. And the Holocaust is eloquent testimony to what a very few, moved by intense clinical passion, can accomplish. And so when you look here, what you see is that he's going to take this balanced view. But what he's doing is conceding a whole bunch of moral claims that, the Holocaust was the greatest barbarism in human history. Well, I mean, look, I'm no Holocaust denier. And there's no doubt about it that a lot of Jews died at the hands of the Germans simply because they were Jewish. There's no disputing that. I mean, the people who say, oh, no, it's all made up, those people are nuts. But to say that it's one of the worst acts in human, it's nonsense. I mean, 8 million Russians were killed by the Nazis. The Nazis killed a lot of Slavs. We after the war was over, we killed 1 million Germans. Just basically starved them to death. I mean, there's a lot of horrible things that have happened in human history. If you're going to put the list of barbaric things that happen, I think that what happened to the Jews is going to fall pretty far down the list. Now, not to them. To them, it's the most important thing ever. And it's understandable. It's like the Troubles in Ireland mean a lot to the Irish, probably even still to this day. But it don't mean anything to me. I'm not Irish. I don't care what it doesn't mean anything to me. So just because the Jewish people put what happened in Germany in the middle of the last century as at the top of their list doesn't mean it's at the top of their list. But see, Buckley will concede all that because really what he's up to here is shaping the moral, framework in such a way that A, he can be the good guy, and B, that he has a justification for getting rid of the people that his benefactors would like him to get rid of. And that's what you see here. But it actually is worse than this, because he's saying that anti-Semitism is a terrible thing, and then talks about how his father was an anti-Semite. I mean, think about that. I mean, this propensity that we see all the time now, especially amongst conservatives, but just white politicians and white commentators, to trash their ancestors, to say horrible things about the people of their past, the people that are in the scrapbooks that their mother and grandfather gave to them, pictures of these people, and say, I'm going to say horrible things about them so I can feel righteous today. I mean, think about the monster that thinks like that. I mean, it's absolutely incredible to me. When Buckley was writing this, he was talking about and trying to frame anti-Semitism as the worst possible sin, and is willing to throw his own family under the bus, calling them the worst possible sinners, in effect, just so he can pat himself on a little in the back and present himself as this good guy in this new age in which this new moral code is now being formed up. I mean, it really is just sick, but it's a pattern we see over and over again. David French this is a guy who's made his whole damn career on this. He's a guy who looks around and says, oh, here's a left-wing fad. Let me have a confession about how I slowly came to see this as the truth. And then let me go and condemn everybody, including my own family if necessary, to show how much I'm a believer in this. It really is just sickening, frankly. But it actually gets worse. Here's after, a few paragraphs, few pages later. My father and his generation lived in an age in which anti-Semitism was very widespread. This is not true. I suppose there is no harm in revealing that it was George Bundy, or McGeorge Bundy, former dean of Harvard, former national security assistant to President Kennedy and Johnson, former president of the Ford Foundation, who told me one day at lunch, apropos of I forget what, that if he were to hear spoken today the kind of thing that was routinely spoken at his father's lunch table, he would leave the room in protest. Yeah, sure. I knew exactly what he meant, because at my father's lunch table one heard, I must suppose, the same kind of thing. Interestingly enough, the bias never engaged the enthusiastic attention of any of my father's 10 children, any more than Mr. Bundy's 4, except in the attenuated sense that we felt instinctive loyalty to any of father's opinions, whether about Jews or about tariffs or about Pancho Villa. 7 or 8 children in Sharon, Connecticut, among them 4 of my brothers and sisters, thought it would be a great lark one night in 1937 to burn a cross outside a Jewish resort nearby. That story has been told, and my biographer, John Judas, points out that I was not among the wretched little band. He fails to point out that I wept tears of frustration at being forbidden by my senior siblings to go out in that adventure on the grounds that I, at age 11, was considered too young. Well, now he didn't just throw his father into the bus. Now he's throwing his brothers and sisters into the bus. I mean, think about the sick bastard who would write this kind of crap. But this is the guy who defined what has become purge culture in the conservative movement, cancel culture in general. And this is the kind of stuff that 40 years ago he was conjuring up. Now, look, I actually did some homework on this. I went to see if this is actually true. Is there any record at all that there was a cross burning anywhere in Sharon, Connecticut? And what I found is that there is not a single record of this ever happening, not just in Sharon, Connecticut, but in Connecticut. I couldn't find anything that supported this. Now, look, in 1937, it was a different time. It was a bleak time. You'd remember a cross burning at a Jewish facility. I don't care who you were or when it would happen. Look, in the 1930s, there was no widespread anti-Semitism in this country. Jews were not hiding under their damp beds. That's complete nonsense. This has been talked about a million times, especially in New England. Jews were very successful and very integrated into elite culture. The Inwood Country Club, which was in Long Island, it held at the beginning of the century all of the elite golf tournaments, the USGA, I think it is, or maybe is it PGA? I think it's USGA. They held their big championships at Inwood and a couple other country clubs in the New York area, which were Jewish-owned country clubs. They were only owned by Jews. You couldn't be a non-Jew. You couldn't be a Catholic and get in. So this idea that there was this widespread anti-Semitism and Jews were constantly being harassed as they ran down the streets and people were openly anti-Semitic is complete garbage. There is no truth to it. There's not a single bit shred of evidence. And look, Americans can rightly be proud of the fact that by and large, we really are not bigoted people. We've never been bigoted people. The issues we've had with the black population, whether it's discrimination, institutional discrimination, or lingering sort of informal discrimination, We need to give ourselves a break here. We've done the best we can. There's simply, the differences are so huge, there's always going to be frictions, there's always going to be problems. But when it comes to the European population, we've been really, really good about not being bigoted to people. Sure, the Irish got a little bit of abuse in the 19th century, and Italians maybe here or there, or Russians certainly during the Red Scare, Catholics and so forth. But you're talking about trivial stuff, small stuff. No one was in fear for their lives or having their lives destroyed or their rights denied. I mean, it's just a bunch of crap. But this guy, in order to curry favor with his new wealthy friends, is not only willing to trash his father, trash his father's generation, trash his own brothers and sisters, but he's also willing to trash his own damn country. He's basically willing to say, I'm going to champion the project that says America was an anti-Semitic, terrible place to the Jews, and we have a moral obligation to, even though we're the ones who fought World War II and against the Nazis and sacrificed blood and treasure to defeat the Nazis, we're just as guilty of the Holocaust as the Germans were. I mean, this is what this guy is saying. It's just monstrous. And yet this is the guy who ultimately created the model for destroying a guy like Joe Sobran. And this really gets at the heart of the problem we have today. Our moral arbiters are moral nullities. These are people who can make no distinction between the truth and a lie or right and wrong. They just look at which one will advance my interest the best. And the term for that is sociopath. And this is what Bill Buckley is revealing himself to be as a sociopath. Now, he finally gets around to, it's funny how this all kind of works, is that basically the way that this set up with Sobran is a big chunk of it, the first half or so, is basically Buckley trying to inoculate himself against being basically just a sellout and a con man. And he starts his narrative here in getting serious about it. After he, sets it all up, says, I used to be a bad guy, but then I learned my ways, and I understand that this entirely new moral code is timeless, and I should have known better. And thankfully, some hick from flyover country sent me a letter about this Joe Sobran guy who was in my midst. And now we get to the point about Joe Sobran. Early in 1996, I scheduled a private dinner with him, that's Joe Sobran, at which I told him that I thought he should know that in his syndicated column, he was gradually giving his readers the impression that he was obsessed on the subject of Israel. More, I told him that, unlike obsessions with, say, Nicaragua or China or even Russia, an obsession with Israel at the expense of Israel gives rise to suspicions of an awakening antisemitism. Antisemitism, I told him, is a mortal disease in this profession. I even joked about it a little. William Scranton, I remember saying, had for a generation been among the 2 or 3 most influential Republicans in the country. Then President-elect Nixon sent him to the Middle East to survey the scene. He returned to say that he thought the Nixon administration should be more even-handed in managing the problems of the Middle East, and he was never heard from again. We both laughed. One does laugh when acknowledging inordinate power, even as one deplores it. It would not have occurred to me that evening to suggest to Joe that he avoid anti-Semitism, because to do so would have sounded as patronizing and unnecessary as to warn him against contracting syphilis. But 6 months later, I judged it to be a crisis time. I called the senior staff of National Review together. We met 3 times, twice with Joe. What led to those meetings and what issued from them is compactly explained in the editorial I wrote in July 4th, 1986. Now, what Buckley did with this is basically put Joe Sobran on double secret probation. And what he did, and again, this is a pattern we've seen before, is that, in fairness to Buckley, and I guess I've been pretty hard on him for, 20 minutes now or so, is he did try to defend his friend a little bit by saying, look, you really can't write about Israel. You can't write about the Jewish lobby. You really shouldn't write about history, particularly certain subjects of history. Because, well, you're getting this reputation, and so anytime you write about it will continue to compound it. It might be in your best interest to just not write about that anymore. And what we see here is a pattern. It's not just, again, in politics or in the chattering classes. This is something you see in the corporate space. I remember running into this in the 1990s. I think I mentioned before about the invisible man in a room business. Well, you also get this other thing, that this assertion that, people are starting to say these things or get this opinion of you, so you should avoid doing X because, it's going to feed into that opinion. it's really a very passive-aggressive way of threatening someone. That, look, you're getting a, reputation of being a heretic, and anytime you talk about this subject, people just assume that it's a proof of your heresy. So you should not talk about it. In other words, stop writing about this stuff or else. I mean, it's really what's going on here. And what Buckley did is he has this dinner, and then he writes this essay for National Review. I'm not going to read it. It's very long. And if you can find this book, it's probably still $1. But, it's a long essay where he lays out all these different, on the one hand, on the other hand, that kind of business, and basically comes to the conclusion that, look, I understand how some people, well, you might think that what Joe Sobran is writing is, beyond the pale and, over the edge. But, I've known him for a long time, and, and then people who know him know he's really not like that. He's just unaware of the changing sensitivities. And, I think he's coming around to it, that kind of thing. And it's, again, this conceding the moral ground while at the same time pretending to be standing up for principle. This is a thing that Buckley perfected and inculcated in the conservative movement. And much of what I think paleocons railed against, the reason why a lot of these guys picked on the Israel issue, for example, is that this bizarre relationship the United States has had with Israel going back a very long time now, it really goes back to Johnson. Johnson, he hired this guy, or was friends with this guy named Krim, I think his name was. He was a big Hollywood producer, and he was a huge Zionist. His wife, the woman he married, was actually a Swedish woman who converted to Judaism so that she could help the Zionists fight the British. I mean, that's how fanatical she was. And, he was buddies with Johnson, and he basically was given carte blanche to run Israel policy and Middle East policy. So you're talking about 1960s here. So 20 years before Buckley's feeling all this pressure to knuckle under to the Israel lobby and the neocons, the Israel lobby was running crazy in Washington. So it's not a new thing. But what these guys like Buckley and Sobran and Buchanan and Sam Francis, a lot of others, they used to be able to point out, it used to be okay to say, hey, look, this is not a healthy relationship we have with Israel because we're a big country, they're a small country, and we can't give them a veto power over our policy in the region. We should be more even-handed because there's a billion Arabs. We got to be on good terms with them. We got to find some way to strike a balance. It's all very reasonable. But what started to happen, though, is that reasonable argument started to become anathematized. And guys like Buckley are getting pressured to say, you can't keep making this reasonable argument. It's making us look bad, man. We love giving you money. We love inviting you to all the right parties and giving you guys attention and all this stuff. But you got to do something about this Sobran guy. You got to do something about this guy or that guy. You can't allow this kind of conversation to happen. And so this is the evolution of what conservatism is going to be. It's like, well, what's the way around it? You start conceding all these moral points to the guys who are pressuring you, about any questioning of Israel is considered anti-Semitic. And then you say, well, it's our principles that we don't tolerate immoral behavior. So you wind up conceding the moral principle here on Israel, and then eventually firing all the guys who say, hey, wait a second, the moral principle just changed. What's going on here? So we're at the point here where it's clear, Buckley is not doing this chronologically, but in the story with Sobran, supposedly he gets this letter that starts opening his eyes to the evils of Joe Sobran's anti-Semitism. And then he has this soul-searching where he starts thinking about the days when he was burning crosses in the synagogues and stuff. And then we get to, the real story here, where he starts getting pressure from people like John Poderitz and, the other neocons. Poderitz's name comes up quite a bit here. And so, he realizes that, okay, I got to do something about Joe Sobran. This is creating a problem. At no point does Buckley ever really say that he disagrees with Sobran's critique. He simply says that it's creating a problem. He's getting this pressure. So he has this big meeting, and he has this, he writes this long essay in National Review, conceding many of the critical points to the people he supposedly opposes. And then he essentially says, well, Joe Sobran is a good guy, he just misguided, and, he's never going to do it again, right? Well, of course, and again, here's a thing we see happen over and over now ever since, is that basically Buckley is coming out and saying, all right, I will concede all these moral points to you guys, and And, Sobran will be more careful. And basically the agreement he makes is that Sobran's not allowed to write about Israel or any of this stuff in National Review. And that if he's going to write about it in his syndicated column, he has to talk to Buckley about it in advance. So in other words, he has to get permission from Bill Buckley before he writes in his syndicated column about Israel or the Israel lobby or any that kind of thing. And Sobran largely agreed with it. And Buckley admits that, the post all seemed fine to him. But of course, he puts this rule in place. He tries to find this medium ground, and it's not enough. The old line about you never apologize, you never concede an inch to these people is true 40 years ago, and it's true today. As soon as Buckley does this, he starts getting pilloried by Commentary Magazine. That's the Norman Prederitz started this, so his fat, stupid son, John Prederitz, would have a job. And of course, John Prederitz writes a mean letter to Buckley. What's this guy? Marty Peretz, who used to run, I think he's dead now. He used to run, the New Republic. Buckley, to his credit, he puts all these guys in there. All these people say it's not enough. And as far as they're concerned, it doesn't matter whether Joe Sobran isn't not, in fact, an anti-Semite. It's that he writes these columns we don't like about Israel and about American foreign policy, and we don't want him writing them. So if it means we have to call him an anti-Semite, then we will do that. And that's essentially what's going on here. It really is quite somewhat, to a certain degree, a remarkable acknowledgement. But you got to remember, this is this model, this template is just being hammered out at this point. Joe Sobran was really the first run at it, sort of the shakedown cruise, or, the proof of concept. That's probably the right way to think of it. This was the proof of concept. This was the first time that the Israel lobby and the neocons in particular could use these kinds of arguments to destroy a career. Because it wasn't enough to just get him to not talk about it. If Sobran had agreed, he wasn't writing this in National Review, it didn't matter. They kept going after National Review because they understood that National Review was the flagship publication of conservatism. Buckley was this guy who was, a bon vivant, showed up on television and he gave speeches. It's really kind of hard to imagine modern people how much of a rock star Bill Buckley was like in the 1980s. When he gave a speech, I forget where I was, but he came to give a speech at the local college, and it was crazy. It was like the Pope showed up or the president. I mean, it was just a wild scene outside the college. Protesters. I mean, it was just crazy. I was a young person. I mean, it was a hell of a lot of fun, to be honest. I mean, it was like a circus atmosphere, and that's because of Bill Buckley. And of course, colleges or universities were different then. They would actually have people on that the crazies didn't like. Nowadays they don't do that. But so Buckley, he was a gatekeeper. He was the guy who would decide what was and what was not acceptable. And these guys figured that out and said, if we can pressure him to silence these critics of us, that means these critics have no place to go. They're not going to be in acceptable conservatism, and they obviously don't exist on the other side, on the left. So we can own the information space. And Joe Sobran in this regard was the proof of concept. So it was a little clunky. And so back in the 1990s or 1980s, early 1990s, when Buckley is summarizing all this stuff, he leaves a lot of this in there. You can kind of see the fingerprints of the usual suspects and what they're up to. Now, Sobran wrote a column that Buckley didn't like, and then things kind of came to a head. And then Sobran basically wrote a column saying, look, this is what the hell is going on here with Bill Buckley. He's not playing it straight. He's getting all this pressure from all these different groups, and he's basically confirming what I have been saying, that these people have way too much power in our politics. When he's talking about Israel and I guess the neocons, at this point they wouldn't have been called neocons. The term neocon really, it really wasn't around in the 80s, and I guess early 90s it would have been a tough call. But anyway, eventually, Sobran writes this column, and it comes to a head. Sobran gets fired. So, hey, it's not the end of the world, right? He just gets fired from National Review. No. He loses his syndicated column. All the usual suspects start piling in, the SPLC, the ADL. All these people are all assembled to condemn him. The 5 minutes of hate. I always called it, he gets hurled into the void, right? He's an unpersoned. He's nobody anymore. And, of course, he loses all this stuff, and people, his friends, are looking at this saying that this great writer is being destroyed by this mob led by the usual suspects, and they do try to help him. But of course, those people wind up getting pilloried. Pat Buchanan, who started American Conservative, he tries to bring Sobran on to write for him. But of course, Scott McConnell, the guy who was running, he was a managing editor at the time. I'm not sure if he's even still alive anymore, but doesn't really matter. He says, no, we can't have him on anymore because he finds a reason. Apparently Sobran was hanging around with, I forget anymore who it was. It could have been Mark Webber. I'm not 100% sure of it. Mark Webber, every time his name pops up, I seem to remember him having, I don't think he was a Holocaust denier, but I think he was one of these guys who got a little too enthusiastic about, questioning some of the arguments about the Second World War. I can't remember anymore. But anyway, a lot of these guys, they got David Irving, a lot of those guys many of them are dead now. They got treated horribly because of this model that as soon as you ran afoul of this group of people, they could destroy your career because they could destroy a career, by calling you an anti-Semite. All these other little goofballs in the conservative movement became terrified of them because, if they can destroy Joe Sobran, who is probably the best writer of his generation, he's that good, right? He's there. There's Sam Francis, there's Pat Buchanan, there's a few others who, in terms of newspaper columns, everybody acknowledges these guys are at the very top. And if these guys can get nicked up, well, then some dullard like Scott McConnell, he ain't got a chance, So as soon as these people say jump, he says, well, how high? And this became the model. This is what's happened. As soon as someone starts asking the wrong questions or becomes inconvenient, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Israel or anything else. You just say, hey, what we need to do is we need to get rid of this guy. We need to dig around and find, is there anything about race that he said that's now considered taboo? Is there anything about Israel that he said is taboo? Is there anything about the Second World War is about taboo? I mean, look, they tried this with Daryl Cooper. They tried to claim that somehow or other he's a Holocaust denier. But as far as I know, I watched his interviews. He doesn't talk about the Holocaust at all. He talks about Churchill. That seems to be his main thing. So, but, they don't like anyone questioning this narrative because, well, if you start questioning a narrative, you can question all of it. And it removes their power as these moral arbiters, who is allowed in and who is not allowed in the public square. And this is where it all developed. This is how it started 40 years ago. Joe Sobran was really the first victim. I mean, some people would say there were others, the Birchers. I think I mentioned this before. But the Birchers were kind of nuts. I mean, I've read a fair bit about the Birchers, and I know they've reformed themselves or something different now and all that, and that's fine. I don't if there's any Birchers that are listening to me, I'm just going on what my recollection was in my youth. I remember hearing about this and then reading up on the Birchers. I remember actually even the library I was at reading up about it, and the claims they made were just completely bonkers. Buckley's purging of the Birchers really had nothing to do with outside pressure or anything like that. It was really about just sort of cleaning up this movement that he had been part of creating and trying to, bring it mainstream. But Sobran, in my view, is the real sort of first victim of this. And it was dealing with him that Buckley slowly evolved along with his new benefactors, the neocons and the Israel lobby, where he slowly sort of perfected this style. And of course, it didn't just come, with the Israel question. It expanded out. It became other things that you couldn't talk about. Mark Stein got fired from or quit. I'm not sure exactly which one, or maybe mutual agreement. Left National Review because he didn't hold the newly approved opinions on homosexuality and homosexual marriage. So, he had all these gay guys working at National Review. It's actually owned by a gay guy now who's married to a man. Wait. You have to laugh. But anyway, what happened to him? All of a sudden they start whispering about him saying, oh, well, he also holds these kinds of unconventional views. And it's, this model of driving people out really started with Sobran. They kind of perfected how it would work. And the sad thing is, it's true about a lot of these guys. And it's why, you can kind of tell I have a real tough time having any sympathy for conservatives at all. And it's because they ruined a lot of people. Joe Sobran was, he was a professional writer, and they deliberately ruined this man's life and took his livelihood away. And I think in no small part because he was a man of principle. He got all this pressure. He was not a stupid man. He understood what was happening, but yet he insisted on writing what he was going to write because he believed in it, because he believed it was true. He was doing his best work, and that was the extent that he was willing to go. He wasn't going to change his opinions or ignore certain topics because, well, it was expedient or that, he could get paid more. And that's a rare quality. I mean, you see today that, in our right-wing influencer culture, there's people they'll do anything for $1. They'll degrade themselves, they'll humiliate themselves just for attention and clicks. I mean, it's disgusting. But Sobran was an honorable man. And I think a fair bit of envy also was a part of this. Sobran was a much better writer than Buckley could ever hope to be. Buckley was a terrible writer. His writing was turgid. It was full of unnecessary language. He would constantly use a 50-cent word when a 5-cent word would work just as well. He violated all the basic rules, all of which was done to promote himself as some sort of, super genius when in fact he was, above average. A very good schemer for sure. He was a very shrewd man. And I mean, perhaps that's what's necessary to, do the kind of job that he had. But I think, a lot of these guys he chased off, to a great degree, it had to do with the fact that he was envious of them. They were smarter, they were more sophisticated, and they were certainly better writers. And that's very true in the case of Joe Sobran. And then, and sadly, he's to some degree forgotten. There's still a lot of his work up there. You can, if you Google Joe Sobran and the Hive, there's a whole bunch of essays in which he developed this idea of the Hive. I've referenced it before. There's some other essays of other people who picked up on it. I think you might try to find some of his archives around. I don't know off the top of my head, but there's probably stuff out there. So that's the show on Joe Sobran. And actually, it's more on Bill Buckley on Joe Sobran. So I hope everyone enjoyed that trip in the past. I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and I will be back next week.